My name is Jahan Dar. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I work for Eden's Counseling Group, based in Houston, Texas. My presentation is going to be on understanding racism-based trauma and steps towards healing. I wanted just to give a little bit of background information about myself. Like I mentioned, I'm in Houston, Texas. I'm originally from the Pennsylvania area, closer to the Philadelphia side. I grew up there and have been in Houston for about 3 years, almost 3 years actually. But since we're talking about race, I think it's relevant to share that I identify as Pakistani and Muslim, um, and that's just to give it some context. I'll be sharing some of my experiences as I'm drawing from the literature as well. So just a brief introduction of basic concepts. Sometimes it helps just to review what, we use these terms a lot. We've been using, race and ethnicity a lot. So I just kind of wanted to give some clarification about it. Race is defined as a social construct that categorizes people based on visual differences. And the significance about it arises from, out of these meanings and definitions that we attribute to it. And the way, that our societies assign meaning to this idea of race. So it's really interesting because there's I'm sorry, I think I clicked on the wrong thing. There's a YouTuber goes by the name of Jay Smooth, and he made a really good comment about how race is a concept that wasn't meant to make sense. Yet our society structures race in ways where it's perceived to be biological, cultural, social, and political. And this is really relevant when we talk even about religious communities. Like, for example, I'd mentioned that I'm Muslim. So being Muslim is a religious identity, but it has become racialized. So a lot of things about when we talk about being Muslim, we tend to associate that term with particular ethnic groups, even though it's not a race. And the term ethnicity just refers to shared history, culture, values, language. It can also include nationality and religion. And I'm going to be using these terms, racial and ethnic, interchangeably. Something I want to talk about is the definition of racism, because a lot of the discussions about racism, as we're hearing more and more about it in the media, a lot of it has been sort of generalized. But it's really important to emphasize that racism is historically constructed and systemic. And I'll get into a little more detail about what I mean by systemic. And it's a process of domination against people of color. It's sought to legitimate the inequality of people of color and proclaim superiority of the racial group that represents the dominant group. And it's really important to recognize that racism is very multidimensional, that it exists on a systemic level in many different spheres and institutions in society. Okay, and this is a little graphic here to kind of help illustrate what we're talking about when people say systemic racism, because we hear that a lot by politicians and on TV and in the media. So basically, when we talk about systemic, we're looking at the circle on the right-hand side, and we talk about racism that exists on institutional levels. So that's like within an organization. And then structural racism, which it means that all of these institutions, actually it exists across institutions. So, healthcare, education, law enforcement, the prison system, those are the various forms of institutions, and structural racism is how they all are interconnected and interlocked. And then there's the interpersonal forms of racism. That's the interactions between people. And then on the individual level, these are the individual beliefs that people have, whether they're conscious or unconscious, externalized and internalized. And we'll get into more detail about that as we go on. So, we talk a lot about like, when we hear racism in the media and in movies, it's very easy to kind of like point out which is the racist character or who's a racist. And oftentimes when we think of somebody who's racist, we tend to think of that person to look a particular way, like, like a KKK member or like a neo-Nazi. But really in the modern day society, racism has become more subtle and covert. And that's not to say that we still don't see overt forms, we still do, but there are things called racial microaggressions. And the microaggressions refer to these daily insults or put downs, and they convey unconscious demeaning messages to people of color. Um, and they reinforce this identity. This sense of they reinforce these stereotypes in subconscious ways. Like, and sometimes people don't even realize that they're saying something harmful or negative. They sometimes can say it like it comes off as a compliment, or in their mind they think it's a compliment. So it's like saying to somebody, in the graphic here, it could be saying to like a person of color, "Oh, you speak English so well," especially if it's somebody who, um, is South Asian or Asian, um, or Arab. Like, the implication is like, "Oh, well, you're not supposed to speak English really well," or it's like telling like a black person, "Oh, you're so articulate," right? Like that's the expectation is that you're not supposed to be well spoken, and that so that person think the person who's making the comment is thinking that they are complimenting you, but they're actually not. So there are a bunch of different examples here. It's like, what are you? Why do you sound so white? Your name is too hard to pronounce. You're not like other Muslim people. Where are you from? That's a typical question. Know where you're really from. And then, you're really pretty for someone so dark. All of these things are, they're hurtful, and they can amount to um, even more stress the more people hear it over and over again. And when we define racist incidents, we're talking about verbal attacks, physical assaults, or threats that targets a person's ethnic self-identification and sense of self. So Ken Hardy talks about it as like this assaulted sense of self. And everybody responds to racism in very different ways. And typically what we see is there's emotional, physical, and psychological discomfort and pain that results from racist incidents. One of the more insidious effects of racism is this idea of internalized racism, and that's when a marginalized racial population accepts the negative societal beliefs and stereotypes about themselves. And now, when we talk about racism in the context of trauma, that's something I really want to emphasize on, because I feel like even though there's been a lot of awareness about racism and there's a lot of discussions going on, I do feel that it's important not to sugarcoat things. And, very, very much so, the reality is that a lot of people have been, and a lot of organizations especially, and these a lot of big companies have been using this language of anti-racism or diversity and inclusion as as kind of lip service, and that not really grasping the full effects of it. And the reality is that racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress, those things are used, those two terms are used interchangeably. um, the reality is that there are short-term and long-term effects of racism, and that racism needs to be seen as as causing trauma. Um, so when we talk about race-based traumatic stress, we're referring to all type of encounters with racial bias and discrimination, and even hate crimes. And Hardy talks about, he describes racist oppression as a traumatic form of violence that can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. And typically, with people who've in several studies, they've found that people who've been victimized or who've experienced racism, um, many have responses that are typically associated with psychological trauma. So they'll have dissociative symptoms, hypervigilance, intense anxiety and avoidance. Some other effects that people may experience are headaches, vomiting, nightmares, feelings of humiliation, low self esteem, ulcers, back pains, lack of motivation. So we're seeing signs of depression there too, increased heart rate, recounting racist incidents days, weeks, months, or even years after the encounter. And that's a reality, is that a lot of people will replay those moments over and over again in their minds, or they might even imagine scenarios where they'll imagine the past encounter, and then they will wish that they could go back to that and be like, well, what else could I have done? I should have said this, I should have done that. And Harold talks about 6 types of situations that can lead to racism-based trauma. And these 6 situations are listed here. So racism-related life events, that's often a direct experience with racism, like on an interpersonal level. It could be something like workplace discrimination, or it could be somebody using a racial slur against them, or it could even just be those microaggressions that we talked about. And then there's vicarious racism experiences, and that's the more indirect. It could be like maybe a friend of yours has gone through it, and or maybe you've witnessed something in a classroom or in a workplace. It could be like a family member that you know of is dealing with a lot of racism. The third one is racism microstressors, and that's refers to that's just another word for the racial microaggressions. Then there's chronic contextual stress, and that refers to constantly recognizing all of these systemic barriers that you're experiencing. So it's like lack of access to healthcare, um, difficulty finding a job because of bias against you, and that's what he means by chronic contextual stress. That this is something that happens on a routine basis in various institutions. And then there's a collective experiences of racism, and that's just feeling this sense of like, okay, there's this assault on us as a community, like on us as a group. So that's relevant to a lot of communities of color. Um, and then there's transgenerational transmission of group traumas, and we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about historical trauma. But that's particularly relevant for a lot of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color where there's been a long history of racism. I thought it would be helpful to share this quote from a doctor, Dr. David Chai, who talks about how he describes what what racism can feel like physiologically. And he just talks about think about what happens to your heartbeat and your blood pressure when someone treats you harshly or unfairly. So like, for example, if someone's cutting you off on the freeway, you notice that you have a physiological reaction to it. Now, if we're talking about it with racism, imagine all these things that we were just talking about with the chronic and the routine everyday bias that you're having to deal with. And eventually is going to take a toll on you physically and mentally. So he talks about how this leads to an accelerated physiological wear and tear. Just to kind of give, when we talk about racism, again, like we're, like every community deals with it in distinct ways. But the important thing is to remember that a lot of all the experiences, they're interconnected. So while they, but it's also important to recognize that every community is dealing with different levels of racism in very distinct ways. So studies have found that Black adults are about 5 times as likely to report being unfairly stopped by police because of the race than white adults. And media images or videos of police violence against Black people may contribute to PTSD-like symptoms. It might heighten this perception of systemic racism. Um, uh, heightened awareness of systemic racism and increased fear of victimization, diminished trust. It could be a trigger for previous traumas. And then there's this community bereavement that comes with it, and this is something that isn't, I'm gonna go back to later on in the presentation, but it's constantly, if you're, the media news cycle, just whenever there's like with George Floyd, for example, the news cycle just kept repeating and replaying the video over and over again. And for a lot of people, particularly Black people, when they're watching that, there have been reports of feeling traumatized by that, like having to, see images of somebody who looks like you, of people who look like you, being constantly devalued, dehumanized, and brutalized. And so that can get internalized and lead to these PTSD-like symptoms, and it takes a toll. And the last statistic I had down here is there are high levels of psychological distress about family stability among Latino or Latina parents due to U.S. immigration policies. So you see how, like, various different groups are impacted by systemic racism in distinct yet interconnected ways. So I mentioned kind of the transgenerational trauma. So with historical trauma, these are legacies of racism, enslavement, and genocide. And these are these realities, or these historic events, amount to traumas that undermine group identity, values, meaning, and purpose. When we talk about slavery, colonialism, genocide, these are particularly relevant to Black and Indigenous peoples. And in addition to undermining the group identities and shared meaning and values, it can also manifest in symptoms of hopelessness and despair and anxiety. Since we are talking about racism-based trauma, I do think it's also, it's critical to mention intersectionality, and this idea of, it's really a fact that we all have. We are all not just one particular social identity, and so this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and she just uses term to. Originally, it was used to for to focus, to emphasize on women of color in particular, and how in anti-racist discourse, women of color were left out of the conversation. I mean, their focus was mostly on Black men and men of color, and then in feminist discourse, the focus was particularly on white women. So Kimberly Crenshaw just talked about this idea of intersections, how race and gender intersect, and how we are, all of these aspects of our identity can interact on multiple and often simultaneous levels that contributes to systemic injustice and social inequality. So there's a diversity of experiences that you may have based on all of your social identities. So like women of color, LGBTQ, people of color, traumatic stress doesn't just come from the race-based oppression, but also from gender-based oppression. And I mentioned like with Muslim Americans, like that's religious-based oppression, and with transgender people, that's transphobia. Um, so it's really important to keep that in mind, because I think when we talk about racism, we just see it through the lens of one structural force, when really it's about accounting for all these other factors as well. Okay, so how do we heal and how do we cope? And this is something that a lot of people are curious about, and they ask me, is that okay, what do I do with everything, with all this, when everything is so um, established structurally and on an institutional level. um, and these are some, and I want to present these as ideas, rather than like, okay, everything's got to go in chronological order. It's not that, because everybody's experiences are different. um, just like every person varies from person to person, there's going to be variations with between communities and even within communities. So these are some ideas of how of ways to cope. Number one is, first, just acknowledge of what you're feeling and what you're experiencing. Be aware of it. Be mindful of what's in your thoughts and where you are emotionally. And sometimes it helps just to journal your thoughts and feelings. And I'm going to get more in depth in it in the next slide. Um, but just validating your own, validating the experience for yourself, because a lot of times a lot of the externals will tell you that, okay, this is not well, you're just blowing things out of proportion, or you're misreading things. um, and it's going to be really important to validate that for yourself. Number two is, discuss it. Connect with empathic people that you trust. And this could be these could be friends, family, activists, organizers, spiritual leaders. And the emphasis needs to be placed on people that you trust, because if you're venting to people, or you're talking to people about racism, whether it's racism that you're witnessing or seeing in society, or something you've experienced yourself, um, it's really important to connect with people who are going to show you that support and that solidarity, instead of people who are just going to reject it or deny it, and tell you that, well, this is not, well, you're just reading into things too much. A third idea is community and self-care. And just being, engaging in your community, um, or on an individual level, just engaging in activities that promote rest, physical and mental rest. And like I was saying earlier about the media and social media in particular, it's really important to know when to disconnect. On one hand, it's we're on social media, because we need to know, we want to be informed about what's happening in the world. But at the same time, some of this can be really overwhelming, and especially when there are videos of brutality and racism. um, Self-care can look like just disconnecting from all of that, and investing in, and doing something else, like just taking a break, or connecting with friends, or just engaging in activities that we enjoy doing. um, and then the fourth idea is, empowerment through resistance. And this, and a lot of times we feel powerless with everything that's happening, and we don't know how, like, okay, how can we do something that's constructive? What can we do about it? And it's important to remember that change is not going to just happen. Like, I mean, change can definitely happen on an individual level, but on like from on an interpersonal level. But beyond that, if we're looking at change on a systemic level, that's going to happen collectively. that's going to happen when we're connected with others, people, and that could be people in our community. It could be people in other communities as well, people who identify as that we see as allies, that we trust as allies. So joining anti-racist collectives is important, grassroots organizations, and initiatives that advocate change. And that's really just connecting to like a sense of purpose and cause, and knowing that, okay, I feel so powerless, and in everything that's happening, and recognizing, okay, I want to do something about it. And there's and one of the things that we can do is get involved with organizations that are local or even on a national level. Especially with social media, we can find out about what's going on in different states, right, and all over the country, or even on an international level. Um, so yeah, like all of these things can really help with the healing process, and recognizing we can um, take control of our thoughts and feelings. So self-awareness, that piece that I was talking about, just to expand on that a little bit more, Ken Hardy talks about this idea of internalized devaluation. And that's when again, it's that sense of internalized racism. And when we're able to write things down, um, if we write down our thoughts, we can have a better idea of, okay, do I have any internalized racism? Do I have any internalized negative thoughts? um, and this is a part of the CBT technique, which is you're writing down you know what you're thinking in your mind. So like an internalized racist thought could be, I don't think anybody um, in my ethnic group has ever done anything successful, has never contributed anything positive to society. My people are always violent. Whatever those thoughts are, write them down and then dispute that thought and look at what the counter evidence is. Like, okay, give me proof that this is true, and then give me proof that it's not true, and then you come to a verdict. So it's like this idea of putting your thought on trial and looking at the evidence, and then being able to develop new, like a different perception, like a healthier perception of 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 your community. And then there's this idea of rechanneling rage. So the goal here is not to eliminate rage, but rather to gain control of it and redirect it into something positive. And so this is something that Hardy says, and also Bell Hooks also says it in. She says a variation of this in her book, Killing Rage. And she's talking about how in society there's this tendency to see anger as a bad thing, like as a destructive force that's destructive to yourself and to others. But in reality, if we were to reframe anger and recognize that anger can also point to injustices, it can also lead to something constructive. It can actually be something that steers you in a healthier direction. If we think about a lot of the civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks, like a lot of them, they were angry about an unjust. They were angry about the unjust conditions. So it's not that anger is a bad thing. It's that we can learn how to gain control of it and redirect it into something that's going to be um, constructive and work towards change. So I like what Hardy says about kind of grappling with this. I mean, kind of just engaging with the anger, because that's a very valid thing to feel when we see a lot of the racism that that's happening in the country, or whether it's or if it's racism that we're directly experiencing. Um, so. Another thing that's going to be really helpful in healing with racial trauma, based trauma, is strengthening the sense of racial and ethnic identity development. And again, it's going to be different for everybody. But if you consider somebody who is maybe um, the only person of color in their classroom or in their workplace or in their neighborhood, they may be really disconnected from the rest of their community, including, the history of their people. So learning about your community's history is definitely part of the developing a healthier sense of racial or ethnic identity. Reflect on what you're proud of. Like, what are you what are the things that what makes you proud of being part of that community? And also just having this sense of gratitude for resilience and survival of communities. When we talk a lot about racism, and even in movies about racism, they're often about slavery, or and there are also movies where there's discrimination, and it's easy to kind of just go into that and kind of view that in a very sympathetic way. But it's really important to also recognize the resilience of those communities, and that those communities have survived. Like even with, especially with indigenous communities, um, when we use the word genocide, and, there's this connotation there that um, um, I mean, this sense of, there's this connotation there that these people have vanished and they no longer exist. But that's obviously not true. These communities have survived, and they have gone on, and they're still with us, and they're still confronting racism. And genocide, um, particularly cultural genocide. So having gratitude for your history, where your communities, how much your community has gone through, and where they are now, that can be a very uplifting force and motivation for you. And the research has backed this up as well. Research has shown that racial and ethnic identity strength, being proud and having pride in one's racial background and ethnicity, these things can serve as a buffer between racist experiences and traumatic symptoms. Some additional ideas for coping. And this is from Zainab Amadahi. One of her articles, she talks about establishing, boundaries, and whenever possible, stop trying to change your abuser, she says. And that's just, recognizing what your limitations are. If we're dealing with somebody who has, says things that are verbally abusive or verbally racist, there's only so much we can do to change that person. And it kind of goes back into this idea of, like, what can we control versus what we cannot control. We can't control others. We can influence others, but even that just only goes so far. And it's not about, like, turning, just saying, okay, let's just ignore everything. Instead, it's learning how to pick your battles. Okay, who's receptive to this message, and who's receptive to hearing me out when I need to confront them or call them out on something that they said or did that was racist. And that's going to lead into investing in your own healing. Like, know what you can control and know what your power is. And it's understanding that a lot of times we're socialized and conditioned as people of color are socialized and conditioned to take care of other people's feelings, to be a spokesperson for their entire group of people, or that they feel this responsibility that I need to educate somebody, everybody about my culture or my community. But investing in your own healing is just a reminder to tell yourself that you don't have to do all those things. It's not your responsibility to do all those things. and that it's time for you, as Ken Hardy says, it's time to thrive instead. And and that's when we connect to others. We use our relationships to learn and grow. And when we nurture our community, we also build relationships with other communities as a form of resistance. Because the with the systemic racism, a lot of the forces out there are they pit communities against each other, and that only just strengthens systemic racism. So when communities are building alliances and relationships and solidarity with each other, that's a form of resistance. And the last point she makes is, tell your story. Your story is powerful. Everything you've experienced has value, and you're, in her terms, she says you're honoring your ancestors. So in a very spiritual way, it's it's recognizing, how far you've come, and knowing that you're connected to, um, a legacy that's much more, um, that has much more value than society has, has attributed um, to your community. And another thing too, with the when we're talking about, coping and healing, it seems very obvious, and very obvious to say. And as a counselor, probably this sounds biased, but seeking support from a counselor. There's a lot of distrust from Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities about the mental health profession as well as the medical profession. And a lot of that has to do with, there hasn't been a lot of people who look like them in those fields. So one of the steps is, to increase the visibility and have more people of color in those communities. I mean, in those professions, but at the same time, the professions have that responsibility to remove those barriers, and also to stop perpetuating the overdiagnosis and pathology, and pathologizing of people of color. Because a lot of times people of color will go into therapy and they'll talk about like systemic racism or experiences with racial discrimination, and the focus becomes very individualized, like that they have to do something on their own, and they kind of that they have to that it's very just individualistic, um, instead of connecting this to, okay, these are external forces, and it's going to require systemic changes, and it's going to require institutional changes. And so that's an area that people within the mental health profession need to work on. But as you can see from this list here, there are a lot of directories for um, various therapists of various backgrounds. And research has shown that when the client is matched with a therapist who shares this, similar or even the same ethnic background, it leads to healthier outcomes. It leads to more positive outcomes. So sometimes it really helps to look for somebody who, has a shared racial, gender, sexual orientation, religious, um, um, even age and ability background. So again, that's recognizing the whole intersectionality piece of it. One caveat here that's really important is that just because somebody shares, the same racial background as you, doesn't mean that that therapist is going to connect with you. They could have different political views. So I encourage, if you to be very open with your counselor or your therapist, and ask questions about what are their thoughts about racism. Do they know what systemic racism is, or what is, and all these issues that are very important to you. um, Ask them about, don't hesitate to ask them about that, because that could be really important for your healing. And some points to remember: that healing from racism-based trauma can be a demanding process, very, very demanding on an emotional, mental, spiritual, and a physical level. um, and that these coping strategies will vary across Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And it's important to be mindful that these coping strategies may involve reliving painful experiences, and they that could lead to additional psychological, emotional, and physiological consequences. So, for example, seeking support from somebody, and whether that's a therapist or that's a friend, um, having to process that, it's going to come with like reliving some of those painful experiences. But I tell a lot of my clients, I don't want that to discourage you, because sometimes, I mean, a lot of times, things get worse before they get better. And as Bell Hooks says, a struggle is rarely a pleasurable or safe thing. So when you're in the struggle, um, just recognize that sometimes one of our coping, I mean, a lot of times we feel like our way of coping is that we need to confront the oppressor right away, whether that's like a teacher, or your employer, or it's somebody in a store, wherever you were experiencing this. And uh, it's like it can be really tricky. Like it's much like a lot of people will just say, well, why don't you just say something? Why don't you just say no to them? Why don't you just tell them that they're being racist and that you feel like you're being discriminated against? But the thing is that there are real consequences. People have lost their jobs. People have lost their livelihoods. People get expelled from school for speaking out, and that's just something to be aware of. That you know, as you're don't rush yourself to um, feel like you need to respond to everything, or that you need to go through this whole legal process. And then the thing is, yes, some people they do take it to that level where they want to file a lawsuit against somebody. But there's a lot of um, emotional, I mean, that can be very emotional, emotionally and physically exhausting. And I think, and that's just something to be prepared for. And in that context, I encourage you to find support from the community, because really we need community support, community care, as much as we need self care. So community care in this context would look like, okay, you experience racism in the workplace. You want to contact a lawyer, or you want to get a civil rights organization involved. There's tons of paperwork that you need to fill out. And my hope is that the community, that you have a good support network that could come together and help you with that. And you know, someone who takes you there to those appointments, who can help you with the documentation, with like, because they'll tell you, can you document everything that happened? Um, so just being mentally prepared for that whole process is going to be really important. And also connecting with community online. Don't be afraid to do that if you can't find a community near you. A lot of times people there are a lot of people of color out there who are isolated. They may be, they don't have other people who look like them in their community, or people who don't share the same cultural background as them. And one of the great things about social media is that we're able to find those communities online. Um, and that can be very empowering for people. Just knowing that you're not alone, that there are other people who are also experiencing this. So yeah, don't hesitate to do that. And yeah, I think the other point I just wanted to emphasize on is that when it comes to healing, we're often told that there's a right way to respond to racism, but really, it's important to remember that um, for a lot of times, it doesn't matter how you respond to it. There are always people who are going to vilify you, or see you as like, okay, you're being, they'll see you as a threat. Um, and the thing is to look out for is you don't want those beliefs, or those thoughts, or those experiences to get internalized, because when they do get internalized, you're going to start second guessing yourself, you're going to start blaming yourself. And And that's something just to, again, like that CBT exercise, just like, challenge those negative thoughts, challenge that, that those internalized thoughts, and um, you know externalize it and be like, well, this is not coming from me, this is coming from outside of me. So I think we have like 3 minutes left, but I don't know if anybody can talk, or they can chat, or type in some messages. But I really, thank you so much for listening to this. I know we had some technical issues in the beginning, so I was kind of I was talking a little faster than I usually do. But if you have any questions or comments, you can email me. My email's on the screen here. It's Jahan Zabe at edinscounseling.com. But I'm just gonna minimize the screen and just look at the, on the Zoom